I thought what I would do today is, as the lecture title says, talk about the East U.S., East Asia, or East Asia particularly, after the, assuming for the moment that the U.S.-Korea FTA goes through, and to talk a little bit about what the shape of East Asian regionalism, what shape it might take, and the place of the United States, or the options for the United States, I should say, better than the place, because I think, as you'll see as I go through this, there's a lot that's still up in the air. There's a lot that's still up in the air about where the United States will go in terms of trade and economic policy. There's certainly a lot up in the air about what is happening in East Asia in terms of regional institutions. In order to get where, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but in order to bring us to where we are, let me go back and talk a little bit about U.S. trade policy in the decades before the 21st century. Until the, I would argue that until the 1990s, I'll give you an exception in a minute, United States trade policy, post-World War II trade policy really had two tenets or two characteristics. One, the main top priority for the United States was negotiations in the GATT and then the WTO, the multilateral trading system. I would say that that remains the top priority. We can come back to the implications of what the United States has been doing over the last decade, but I still think that that is the top priority. It will remain a top priority, I think, no matter who is elected president in 2008. The second tenet, if you will, or characteristic of U.S. trade policy was really what you might call unilateral or one-on-one negotiations with major trading partners that we had particular trade issues with. And obviously, in the first years, it was Europe. I mean, this was highly pragmatic. It depended on who our major trading partner was, partners were at the time, and what kinds of issues we had. Obviously, 60s and 70s and more with Asia. Then, as you know, Japan took the top spot for the 70s and 80s. Bilateral agreements or regional agreements certainly create trade, but they also deflect trade from where it would go more efficiently because of differing tariff rates. That debate continues today. He saw trade from the beginning as an instrument of foreign policy, and then increasingly after 9/11, as an instrument of security and diplomatic policy. And it's in the Bush administration that you have the formal laying out in government documents of a strategy that combines trade and diplomacy and trade and regionalism. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Zelig and the president made it clear, particularly after 9/11, that they were pursuing and would pursue bilateral trade agreements to some degree because of their economic effect. Though if you look at the first 6 or 7, they were really small economies. But it was also that they said we will look at this look to countries that will also support us in foreign policy. And foreign policy is a key element of our choice of bilateral trade partners. I should note one thing that's not well known, however. People criticize the Bush administration and early administration for being reactive. Under law, most people don't know this, the United States cannot approach another bilateral partner. We have to be approached. Now, that's easily manipulated by a savvy administration. If you look at the FTAs from 2001 to even till today, there's some that are clearly on a foreign policy basis. Morocco, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. And you also see a situation where foreign policy support for the United States specifically in Iraq meant a difference. Australia was brought to the front of the line in 2002 because of its support of Iraq. New Zealand today still is not on the horizon because of their policy about nuclear ships or any kind of nuclear weapon in their ports. I think that may change. It certainly would change under a Democratic administration, but you can see clear evidence. It was the South Korean FTA, which I think was the first important FTA, not just politically, but economically. And it really is you're into a new ballgame. I'll come back to that in terms of what it means for Asia. APEC, as you know, is not a normal free trade agreement. It's not a free trade agreement under the normal sense, and that is, it's not a reciprocal agreement. The nations of APEC in 1995 agreed that they set a goal of free trade in the Pacific for the developed countries by 2010, which they're obviously not going to meet, and developing countries by 2020. But you were to proceed at your own pace. The United States could continue, assuming that the new president gets trade promotion authority and authority again, to work bilaterally, to argue that, well, we'll go back to Thailand, we'll try to finish off the Korean FTA. I think, by the way, the bad news I'm giving today is that my judgment, which has been bad, by the way, I didn't think the FTA, we didn't have a U.S.-Korean FTA because I wasn't sure either side politically was ready to do it. So take everything I say with a grain of salt and predictions. I would predict, though, that it's going to be 2009 before the FTA, U.S.-Korea FTA is finished. It's actually agreed to. We'll have a new president and a new Congress. I hope I'm wrong, but that's the way it is. Anyway, we can continue down that road. I think, and I don't have any claims to understanding the internal politics of the Korean, this administration or others, but it seems to me that the president understood two things: that Korea could risk being isolated economically. It was caught between an already economic giant, Japan, and an emerging economic giant. And more importantly, it risked being isolated in terms of security and foreign affairs. And for all the bitching on both sides and all the small things and sometimes large things between Korea and the United States, I think most Koreans know the United States has no adverse goals in terms of Korea. We are a disinterested party. Now, there's a problem with our unilateralism that we've dragged people in all kinds of directions, but still there's a sheet anchor there. And I suspect it must have been, without knowing the detail, that's really what began to swing it. I don't think the economics of the FTA are strong enough to really sway the Congress. It's good for both sides. It's better for Korea, I think, in the long run, because the Korean economy is more closed. It's not a big deal for the United States. I said it's the biggest FTA we've ever signed, but still small potatoes. And I'm not saying that in a negative fashion about the Korean economy or the Korean nation. It's still not something you can really persuade. This is a big deal. What is a big deal, though, I think is, and I think this is what will finally sway President Clinton and a Democratic Congress, is that you do not want to be said to get on the negative side of the question of who lost Korea. And that is that I think it's going to be foreign policy and security reasons that will come forward. You see that already increasingly, and not just in Korea, with the Korea FTA, but with other FTAs, where it's being argued in the Congress, and this is in South America. And I think it's a much smaller deal in terms of an FTA, but the same thing is being said with Colombia. We've got Chavez roaming around with another model. You've got the Chinese rolling around with another model of how you develop and what the future of the region is going to be. And do you want to, after all of this, I think it's both sides, and here I'm glad I was wrong, you shouldn't have entered into the negotiations of the U.S.-Korea FTA unless both sides were determined that ultimately it win, that it come through because of the negative consequences. It would be perceived, particularly if the Korean Assembly agrees, as they probably will, maybe not this year, but at some point, to the agreement, when Korea has had to give up more than maybe the United States, and the United States slaps them down, it would be seen as an affront, and understandably an affront, to a long-standing ally, an ally that we increasingly need as a sheet anchor. And so if I had to bet what will swing it finally in the fall of 2009, 2010, will be the foreign policy argument.